I think it's time to start. Very welcome again. My name is Donald Linderud. I work for WWF, and I'm deeply involved in science-based targets for financial institutions. And I'm project managing this tool that we presented last week, which is a tool to temperature score companies and portfolios. We're going to take you through bits and pieces of that today, and we should just need to make sure that we're actually recording this, because we should be recording. Yes, we are recording this. Good. So what I should say then is that we will do sort of an overview of the Python code and the various repositories that you have access to when it comes to that. And today, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A box, but you can also raise your hand, and we'll turn on your microphone so you can speak. We would very much like to keep this as fluid as possible and with as much conversation as possible to hear your sort of feedback on the tool, and to get your questions to make sure that you have everything that you need in order to test it. So once again, we are recording this. The few slides that we're going to show you here, you have probably seen already before, if you had the chance to watch our launch event a couple of weeks ago. On the call today is me, Donald, and Joris, and Chris. Chris is one of the brains behind the methodology behind this tool, and Joris is from Auto Finance and has been developing and leading the code development based on that code. So the agenda for today is just a brief introduction, and we're going to talk about sort of obviously the what the tool is and what it actually does, and then we're going to take a technical tour, which Joris is going to lead, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. I'll leave it up to Joris to decide whether he wants you to interrupt him with questions during his presentation or not, but for me it's all fine if you want to interrupt in the meantime. I try to keep an eye out for your hands raised. So SBTI finance obviously is set up by CDP, WWF, and WRI. We have a number of technical partners, Guidehouse, on the bigger SBTI project, and for this particular tool, we've partnered with OS Climate and Auto Finance to help us actually build this solution. So, and this tool that we're presenting, that we presented last week and that we're going to go through today, is one of 4 pillars in the framework for setting SBTs for financial institutions. So the others are the criteria, the method, and the guidance. And the guidance was actually released today in draft format. So please check that out on our website and contribute to the survey that's attached to that guidance as well, because we would very much like the feedback on that guidance. Yeah, so, but the focus today is on the tool, and the tool covers these 2 methodologies that we have for within the framework. So it's the portfolio coverage and the temperature rating methodology, and we can go into more detail around that. I hope that most of you have had the chance to see the both the methodology launch event that we had in end of April, but also the launch event of the beta testing period for this tool that took place 2 weeks ago, where we went into a little bit more detail around the the methodologies, but you can obviously ask questions around the methodologies as well if you want to. So the actual tool, our thinking around this when we set this up was that we wanted a solution that was open source and transparent and data agnostic, and also that could cater to pretty much any type of user interface you wanted to throw it into. And we wanted to create a workflow tool that sits with portfolio managers, CIOs, ESG and financial analysts, and risk and compliance managers. We, within the SBTI, we searched for that. We couldn't find anything really, and we obviously had the methodology developed by CDP and WWF, which Chris was very much involved in. And so we thought we'd build our own solution for this. The idea is not for SBTI to be a tool developer, but to provide this as an open source solution for others to contribute to and to build off. So therefore, we've engaged a number of data and service providers in this development work as well. We'll come on to that in a second. And we wanted this to be transparent, so you can follow everything from the company's ambition to the actual rating of the company and the rating of the portfolio, so you can follow that the whole way through and how that is actually calculated. We wanted you to be able to use as many different data sources as you want, and we don't want to lock you into one particular data source. We know that data is scarce in this area, especially when it comes to the target data, but it is available out there in one way or the other. If nothing else, you do have some free data on our website on the companies that have actually set science-based targets and got those validated. So that's sort of your first should be your if you don't have any other data, that should be the data you should be looking at if you want sort of real life data for that. And the user interface, we want you to be able to integrate this into any sort of either commercial or homegrown solution that you may be working with, whether that is a Refinitiv, Bloomberg, FactSet, MSCI environment, or whatever that may be. So the project team around this tool has been led by me from WWF. We've had people in from CDP naturally, and WRI as well. As I mentioned, Arctic Finance and OS Climate has been the developers on this after an open RFP selection process. And we've also in the development team, in the project team for this development have had and have still Bloomberg, CDP, ISS, Trucost, and Gentum currently on that team. And we've also had representation from Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance as sort of users of this particular tool. So I think I've sort of explained this slide already, but this is sort of showing you what we are focusing on today. So we have a bunch of input data, of which SBTI have very little, only the ones that is the data that is published on our website in terms of targets. The rest needs to come from some other data source, and I know that most of you would have access to that type of data. For testing purposes, we should say there is a dummy data set that you can download from docs.sbti-tool.org, and you can use that. You will also find a sample data sets and an anonymized sample data sets from Gentum in that same at that same location that you can use for this. So with any data input, we take that into the tool that we're building. So the measure and alignment target setting tool that our work has been focused on, which is an open source methodology and code base that converts essentially temperature or company ambitions into a temperature score. And we aggregate that to portfolio, sector, or market level, whatever slicing you want to use in this solution. And this can be used for a number of purposes, naturally for sort of measure alignment with the Paris Agreement, for submitting it to SBTI for target validation, so that you, as a financial institution, can get a validated target and say, we have set an SBTI target, but also for obviously for financial analysis and for company analysis of companies as one of your inputs into your evaluation and valuation of companies. And that's where we come to the output. So this is where we want that to be integrated into to various different solutions. So that may be sort of solutions from ISS or Bloomberg or MSCI or FactSet or whichever solution you're using, but also into your own proprietary solutions as a managers. And we know that some of you do have those homegrown solutions, and this should be easy enough to integrate into those environments. So the bits and pieces on the left and on the right, so the input and the output, are not free and open source. They are commercial products in some degree, but the bits and pieces in the middle, which is essentially the calculation engine, is open source, both when it comes to the code base and to the methodology. So you're free to use it, and you're obviously free to contribute to it as well. With that, I think that we're going to hand over to Joris, and who can take you through the technical tool of the tool.
Thank you, Donald. If you can stop sharing, then yes. I can take over. Thank you very much.
There we go.
So pick up on the same slide. Hello, everybody.
Should we maybe ask if we have any questions so far that you want to ask? I can't see any raised hands here, but if you do have any questions, then no questions this far. Okay.
Okay.
Everything clear. Very good. Excellent.
Perfect. So first, briefly, let me introduce myself. So I'm Joris Kramwinkel. I work as a technologist at Ortec Finance. I'm very excited to be a tech lead in this project. It doesn't happen too often that we can, in the financial sector, we can work open source. That's what I really like about this project. The project is, by the way, licensed with an MIT license, so you can do actually everything with it. Today I walk you through the bits and pieces, but first let me show you a slide my colleague Dan presented during last webinar when he was demoing our beta release. There we showed you have like different options to use the tool. So on the left side, we host some instances in AWS using AWS Fargate. They can be accessed via the URL in the box. So last webinar, we talked mostly about the UI deployment, but now we dive a bit deeper and going to talk about the Docker deployments and how to use the Python package as a standalone package. So that brings me to the more technical slides. So first I wanted to tell you a bit more about the philosophy of the tool. So it's very important for this tool to be able to integrate in one's workspace. And yeah, in the beginning we acknowledge that the tool faces maybe confidential data like portfolio data, but also target data from commercial data providers is confidential. So that brings us to the philosophy of maybe bringing the model to the data instead doing the other way around. So that's why we choose the following architecture. So we have a 3-layered architecture. At the core, we have a Python module, which can just be installed by running pip install SBTI. I will demo that later on. The reason why we choose to use Python is that being in open source, we wanted to keep the barrier to contribute as low as possible. And we believe that people with a climate background or an engineering background or a financial background are most commonly comfortable in Python instead of production languages like Java and C#. On top of that, we make use of a lot of pandas functionality, as many of you probably in the financial sector. So that's very convenient as well. So at the core, we have the Python module, and it's not very common to run like Python in production. So that's why we wrapped it in a REST API using Docker containers. This way, we make it a production-ready microservice. So today, we run the Python module wrapped into to a Flask and Nginx skin. I will demo that as well later on. And the Docker containers are available and freely available in Docker Hub as well as all the source code. Being the core, being an API, we thought like, yeah, like for demo purposes and for non-tech savvy people, it makes sense to make a lightweight UI on top of it. And that's the UI my colleague Dan presented 2 weeks ago. That UI only shows the API functionalities, and you can click, you can design kind of your request by doing some clicks. More advanced workflows or actual analytics with the Python module. For now, we recommend doing that with Jupyter Notebooks, and I will show you around during this presentation. So this is roughly the overview. Now I will discuss like component by component and give you some technical details there. So first, the Python core. So as I mentioned, we published the Python module in PyPy, the most common Python package repository. So these coming slides are just there for a reference for you to check out after my presentation, but I will like walk through the actual stuff on my computer. So I will switch a lot between the slides and the actual contents. So a good point to start with is the PyPy homepage. So here everything is also available. So here you have all the links also to the source code and the documentation. You can just install the two by running pip install SBTI. The module is documented here. The link is also in the slide, and this is the documentation for the whole tool. So for all three use cases, UI, REST API, and standalone Python, this is available. So the source code is available on GitHub. Yeah, I was just checking how many clones we already had. So this week we had 69 unique clones. So the source code is available here. Not much to see here. We choose the layout of a very that's very common for Python open source packages. Of course, there's a README, but we refer in the README also to the more elaborative documentation here. So to let you play around with the Python module, we thought it would be good to include some Jupyter Notebook examples. Of course, these notebooks, you can run them locally. For this, we assume that you have Python Anaconda distribution installed, preferably a version 3.6 or higher. With this small script, you can initialize your own Conda environment with all the requirements installed already. But if you don't like the hassle, We also made the Python notebooks available in the Grid repository, available via Google Colab. So let just. So here's the Python notebook. So the aim is to make more of those to get you up and running. Let's run all the. Sorry. Let's run all the cells. So you just start with the pip install SBTI, and we use some dummy data. The dummy data is available in the GitHub as well. But of course, you can if you want to try it out on your own data, you can change these file paths to a local path, and that's even more easier when you run it the Jupyter Notebook locally. So it installed the SBTI package. It just has a few dependencies. Actually, it only has pandas and XRD, but those also have dependencies under the hood. So it under the hood installs these packages. So in this example, we just have a sample CSV, a simple portfolio. It's actually a snippet of the top 5 rows in the sample data. And here you can, so please take the time later on to walk through it yourself. But here you have a step-by-step example of all the steps you need to take to go from the raw portfolio data to an overview of your portfolio temperature scores. The tool provides 9 different scores. We have 3 different flavors in time frame, short, mid, and long, and we have 3 different flavors in scope. If you have questions on that, maybe Chris can answer the background of that. So that's what the tool does, and also the tool gives portfolio coverage. So this may look a bit abstract. I will show you the UI afterwards, but actually the UI does exactly the same. So this caters the use case if you want to work on your proprietary data and want to benchmark your portfolios with the SBTI methodology. Of course, you can like make more advanced workflows. You can massage the input data a bit given the output data, but we will provide additional Jupyter notebooks for such situations. Also available in the repository are, so I just run the Getting Started notebook. The tool can also caters also for different scenarios. I will show them in the UI as well, but they're also available. And you have different mathematical ways of aggregate the scores. Yeah, for this we insert example notebooks. So I think on the Python part, that's roughly what I wanted to talk about. So here are all the links as well. So the link to the documentation, and of course the if there are any issues with the module, please post an issue here on the GitHub. For now, we were quite fast in resolving any issues we found so far. Mostly we fix it in a day. This coming in this betting testing period. So if there are no further questions regarding the Python core, then I will move up to the REST API. I'm not sure if I can see any questions, but oh, there. No, there are not. Moving to the REST API. So as I told you earlier, with this tool, we expose all the functionality available in the Python module via REST API. We do that by wrapping it into a Docker container. We have a separate GitHub repository for that keeps it nice and clean, that keeps the Python core containing only Python code. And this repository has a bit more bits and pieces to handle all the Docker stuff. Also, the documentation page introduces you to the REST API. So typical usage here is if you want to either host it in a cloud or want to run it locally. Since it's dependent on Docker, if you want it to run locally and you have a non-Linux server or a laptop, you should install Docker Desktop. Yeah, as of a few months, maybe years, Windows is also capable of running Docker containers. I run Windows locally as well, so it all works just fine. That was a bit different a few years ago. But having Docker Desktop installed allows you to run Docker containers internally. So here in the documentation, you will find like a step-by-step guide for both installing Docker Desktop for Mac and Windows machines, and spinning up the Docker containers. So that's all here. The repository is linked to the Docker Hub. So Docker Hub is like an open repository where build images are available. So you don't have to build them yourself locally. If you want, you can, but it's not necessary. So currently, if you go to Docker Hub and enter SBTI, you will see like 3 different containers. So today we focus on 2. So we have the API container and we have the UI container. This container is currently used in our AWS deployment for beta testers. You don't need to touch that. Just to show you how to do that. The repository contains different flavors of Docker Compose files. These contain all the construction instructions Docker needs to set all up. Here you see that the regular Docker Compose file will spin up the API only. There's a Docker Compose file that also spins up the UI on top of that. I will show you that later on. There's one file that in a situation you want to run your app server locally, your Python stuff locally, but do want to have a UI on it just for developing debugging purposes. This script caters for that. And there is one available if you want to run the API in AWS. Now, since I have pulled all the source code locally, I can just run this command. So this command is available also in the README and in the documentation page. So now it boots both the UI and the API container, and my UI is available at localhost 5000, while my API will be available in localhost 5001. So here's the UI. It's still the same as Dan showed, but let me walk you through. So first you start uploading a portfolio. So let me just upload the portfolio data sample, which is also available via the links in the presentation. So here you need to match the columns in the Excel to values that are known by the tool. So in this case, my holdings exposure mapped to the investment value. If I want, I can upload target data here. So there's for now, for the beta testers, there's an Excel template available to do that. In the end, I will show that later on. In the end, we like to we build connectors. We interfaced data providers in the Python code, and in the end, you should be able to get the your data provider's data, for instance, a Bloomberg via the Bloomberg API or MSCI via the MSCI API. But I will show that later on. But for now in the UI, it's very convenient also for beta use to just upload an Excel. So here you can play around with all these settings. So actually I'm shaping my request here, but let's talk, just use the defaults here. All the documentation on these, what these values are on the documentation page and in the team page. And then you just calculate the score. So probably we see the request coming in. So there's a data provider's endpoint that gives you a list of available data provider. Here it had parsed the portfolio I uploaded, and the main method of the API is the temperature score method, which is a post request. So here I have all the results available. Yeah, please take your time yourself if you want to click through it. The interesting part is what happens under the hood. So under the hood, as I told you, there's this endpoint, this temperature score endpoint. We generated Swagger documentation, which is available if you run it locally or in the /docs of your URL you're running the tool on. So here we documented the endpoints, what you should set in the request, so other people can work with it as well. Yeah, that's roughly it. I think what's also interesting to see is that the I didn't show you when I showed the Python code, but of course there's this API reference, and the API matches to functionality available in this Python module. And also just to show you, all the complete module is very well documented. That's very convenient for your developing, when you're developing, but also when you're building on top of the API. I think that's most of it. Let me check by going back to the slides. What did I discuss? Yeah, so the REST API is very convenient if you want to provide the solution internally in your organization, or by adding it to as a microservice in your platform, or building a web application on top of it. There are also examples when data providers are including the tool. But of course, you can also include it in portfolio management systems like the ones mentioned by Donald. I think I covered all. I showed you the source code. I showed you the documentation page and the Swagger documentation. Of course, you can insert issues also in the GitHub, and I showed you the Docker Hub.
We do have a question. I don't know if you want to stop for
yeah,
that
sure.
in the Q&A here.
Let's do that.
So do you want to have a look at that and read that out and answer that question? Because I think that is mostly for you, I think.
Yeah, sure. So the question is whether we can bypass like pooling the code from GitHub or PyPy, since some organizations have lengthy security processes around that. You can let me think. Yeah, you can just what you can do. I think what I'm not sure if it helps, but you can from this side you can just download the code as a zip file, You can store all the code locally, and then you have all you need to run it. So you don't have to access GitHub automatically or retrieve the Python package from a PyPy repository. In the end, you still need the code somehow, and I believe it's most convenient then to just download the zip. You don't need anything for that. Also, another question to that: does the if you download it, does it record any information, or is everything local? Everything is local. So when you like download the zip and you unplug your computer from the public internet, you will be just fine. There's no traffic going out, and there's once you downloaded the zip and have all the dependencies, there's no traffic coming in. So that should just work. For the you do need a Python installation though, and I assume that access to the pandas library will be there in those situations, but that's an assumption. So there are two packages that are required to run the code from the zip file, that are pandas, which is a very common one. So it would surprise me if that's not the case, and a package to interpreted Excel files, which is also very common. So that would hope that answers the question.
But I think we should add to that also that there is obviously no data going out of this into the ether somewhere, including your holdings or anything like that. Yep. Even if you have to download pandas and numpys and whatever else.
The same holds, by the way, if you download the Docker image. So if you want to just use the same, so you can download the source code, but you can also go to Docker Hub and download the image from there without leaving any trace. So also the UI does not contain any analytics tags or whatsoever. Do you need Docker Hub to run this, or will it run solely on Python? No, you don't need. If you want to run, so I assume that you mean if you want to use the REST API. I can show you. I can also just run this Python file, and then it also runs the API. Might be, oh yeah, I haven't installed the dependencies here, but if you follow the instructions of the documentation, it will install the dependencies, or have if you have the SBTI Python package locally installed, then it has access to this reference, and then you can run the REST API locally as well in Python. I would recommend if you're able to run it in a Docker container, because it's way more production proof. I see more questions coming in. So, is there documentation on the input of the input data, column names, etc.? Let me get to that in the next slide of my presentation. Which input fields are required and optional? Let me give it back to that as well. Can you confirm the identifier uses the company is in? All questions regarding the input data. So let's move on to, from a data provider perspective, what does it mean to contribute in the process? So here are my slides. I had a slide on the roadmap, and that for me was the bridge to talk about data providers, but let's move that forward. So we prepared everything for a data provider to implement their own connectors. Let me show that here. Wait a second. Let me. I think this is more human proof to do that here. So here in the submodule, the data submodule, we implemented like a base class of a data provider. We ourselves implemented the Excel version and the CSV version, as can be shown here. And here, the abstract class data provider requires you to implement the get targets function. And here it states in documentation what you exactly need and which ones are required and which ones are not. It's also, if you want an overview of that, we have an Excel template that it's a very human readable overview. We also have it in the config file of the tool. There you see the required columns. But in the end, if I would be Bloomberg, then what I want as a user is I want to get a JWT token or something to authenticate my Bloomberg license for the Bloomberg API. And what needs to be implemented here is that here it passes through the credential data and makes the API request. And here you do the mapping from for instance, the Bloomberg data to the data we use internally. Did I cover the questions? So let me show you the Teams page where this is available also. Oh. So if you're subscribed as a beta tester, you also here have the documentation folder. So it's a publicly available SharePoint link. And here you have the data provider template. And there the top row indicates whether it's required or not. I should emphasize that the column names in this template are still under consideration. So we want to change them in the end, like these column names, but we want to change them once. So any feedback regarding this column names is more than welcome. But here it states whether it's required or optional, as it is in the Python 2.
On that topic of column names, we should probably also, if we have sort of data providers on the call today, we should obviously say that also that we would very much like feedback on the actual variables answered sort of in those columns. So to get a standardized value for that, so that you need to do as little sort of transformation of the data as possible.
The third question was, well, can you confirm the identifier to use is the company eSIN? That's what we use right now, but actually you can, as long as the your portfolio input contains an identifier, a company identifier or security identifier, and that the identifier maps to the data provider input, it can be anything. But currently we use eSIN by default. But it's flexible what you can use there.
And we only using that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we only using that right now because some of the data in the dummy file we're actually taking from the SBTI websites, sort of Excel download, where you can actually download the companies that have set SBTI targets, and those are identified with ISIN. So that's really the only reason we're using ISIN at the moment. Yeah. So you could actually use whichever identifier you want, because you will, when you ingest the data into the tool, you will also supply the identifier.
So a bit more on the data provider dynamics. So what happens as well, in your request, you can assign one or more data providers. If you assign more data providers, it would like apply a kind of a waterfall. So it would first try to retrieve all the needed data of your portfolio securities with your first preferred data provider, and then it tries to fill any gaps with the additional assigned data providers. So that's also in place. So there's a question on what sources are you using to map issuers via different identifiers? And how are we doing the mapping? Donald, can you elaborate a bit more on that? You have the helicopter view on that, perhaps, or Chris, regarding the mapping.
Yeah, so as I said, I mean the way that we identify these, apart from one case really, when it comes to mapping to the actual targets in a very small number of cases currently, it's like 20 or 30 targets out of 4,000 that are available in the marketplace. It doesn't really matter what you use in terms of identifier. So you can use whichever identifier you want. However, in order to make sure that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris, but it's in the power sector where we have a few targets that are sector dependent, and that we need to map to the correct regression model because of that. And for that purpose, we're using ISIC sector classification currently, as that is open source and free. And the data providers should be doing sort of remappings to that sector classification if they haven't already, if they don't have it, sort of a crosswalk to that. So that's the only caveat to that. But apart from those 20, 30 currently, we should say, because this is something that is developing, obviously. Apart from those 20, 30 companies or targets, rather, you don't actually need any identifiers. Having said all of that, in the current beta version, we haven't implemented the ISIC code whatsoever. So what I just said is really just applicable to the release version that is coming in a few weeks' time. So currently, you can use whatever identifier you want.
Thank you, Donald. So regarding the roadmap, so the main focus is to enhance the Python module and the REST API. Regarding the Python module, I touched upon those points already. We want to include like more extensive notebooks for more advanced analytics. We will do some refactoring on the data representation I just showed you. Currently, it immediately creates a pandas data frame, which is passed through the tool. We wanted to have a class representation first, so we can have a single point where we can make sure all the input data is valid, and we can can do all the cleaning and filling at one place. So that's what will be happening. Also, we will revise some of the namings, as we told you earlier. Any input on that is very welcome. And of course, besides issues we find or tickets that come in via GitHub. On the REST API side, currently the API is like the middleware in between is Flask. And now we have reason to migrate to Fast API, since that's becoming more industry standard, provides you more better performance. And what's very convenient, it generates its own Swagger documentation. Flask doesn't support for that out of the box. And then we also do some refactoring that the API side is very clean. nice and tidy. Another larger feature we will do is we will make the API asynchronous. Currently, we just do a post request and you get a response. We control the performance right now, but in the situation, the engine has to grab to data outside the container. For instance, if it wants to do a request to the Bloomberg terminal to retrieve data from there, we don't have control anymore on the performance, and then it could time out. So what we will do is you do a request, you get a ticket number back, and then you can pull the results with that number. Yeah, those are the main points right now. And currently in the beta release in the AWS version, the container is becoming stateful when you like upload target data. That's also something temporarily. So we want to, in the end, it should be again stateless, but that's like a stepping stone. So you can easily integrate it in whatever infrastructure, microservice infrastructure you have in place yourself. On the contributing to the to this project, description of the guidelines is available in the documentation. We welcome any contribution, so please don't hesitate to reach out. All instructions are in here, and also all the repositories contain the instructions to get started as a developer. So that all should be just fine. I think that was my part of the story. Are there any more questions?
We have just one that's sort of, I think, a follow-up to what we just discussed, actually. And the question is, how are you mapping an equity ISIN to a ticker, Q subsedal, etc.? And just to elaborate a little bit on that, we are not. You are. Because we don't supply, we don't really care which ticker system you are actually using. You can use whatever you want. How are we then mapping them to the right targets? Well, that is actually mapping the actual targets rather than mapping the securities, because obviously a company can have various targets and several targets, and that's why we have if you look through the documentation, you have one tab in the Excel input file for the fundamental data, and then one tab for the target data, and with one line for each target. So one company can obviously have a number of lines in that targets, and that's how we map those targets to the correct regression model that is actually driving the conversion from the ambition to the score. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Chris, but that's how I sort of see it. And that's so with that, with the exception that I just mentioned, that isn't implemented yet, but will be implemented in the release version for those 20-30 targets out of 4,000 currently available in the market, that we don't actually need to map any securities or anything. So the only mapping that that you will need to do in the future, in the full release of this version is where you map those power sector targets, intensity targets. That's the only way that you only time that you actually need that, and that is via the ISIC sector classification, as I said, and we know that there are a number of crosswalks to that sector classification that your data provider should be able to provide you with.
All right.
Would you have anything in addition to that, Chris, or?
No, you've summarized it quite well.
Okay, good. Right. Do we have any other questions? We have another 3 minutes left. I think we had a number of questions during the presentation there. Well, in the meantime, if you stop sharing there, I could just share some sort of general yeah, some general sort of support information. I was just thinking that that could be useful for people, even though we sort of bashed this out before, and we've talked about this. In addition to the links and sort of documentation that yours has been talking about, these can be sort of your go-to support functions. So if you want, you're more than welcome to participate in our Teams group to get support and to provide feedback and to just discuss the tool or the methodology or whatever you want around this project. Just sort of fill in a request to be part of that Teams group if you want. You can naturally send us an email on finance@sciencebasedtargets.org for support and for feedback also. And the documentation, sort of the documentation that you sort of with sample files and such that yours showed us a little bit before, you can access through docs.sbti hyphen tools, it should actually say, .org, not SBT, SBTI hyphen tool.org. And that takes you through to that documentation repository where you find a README file that guides you through all the documentation that is available in that location, and also gives you links to all the documentation that yours discussed today.
Yeah, maybe one last note regarding solving issues. If people are using the AWS deployment for either API use or the UI, if we find any issues and resolve them, then if the master branch of the SBTI package has a new release, then automatically the AWS instances get rolling updates. So you should see like the results of your suggested issue very fast during the continuous deployment streak we have.
Okay, I think our time is up. Thank you very much for attending. I don't think that we have any outstanding questions. So thank you very much for attending this workshop or this webinar, and we hope that you've learned something, and hope that you will be sort of testing and providing a lot of support and some questions through the different support channels and feedback to this development. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.